Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. I was a little nervous to be presenting, but now I am just energized by the peer exchange session and by seeing everyone who is in the room and the passion that they're bringing into the room today. So I'm so excited that you're here. I want to frame a bit for everyone why we wanted to include this session today. And why it's so important to be focusing on this cross-sectoral engagement around affordable housing retrofit specifically. So the need for energy upgrades to affordable housing, both single family and multifamily, is huge. A 2021 International Energy Agency report projects that existing residential buildings need to be retrofitted at the rate of 2.5% each year to reach the goal of net zero emissions by 2050. According to a 2021 ACEEE report, this is 25 times the current rate of home retrofits completed through the leading US programs, Home Performance with Energy Star and the Weatherization Assistance Program. This is the third time you're seeing this slide today, so I'm going to ease on past it. So our goal is to get you all to start talking or to talk more to each other across sectors and to better understand each other's motivations. To do that, we want to get a baseline of how connected you already are to different sectors. So please enter the following in the chat if you would. Name, pronouns, organization, location, what native land you're on, and the answer to the welcome question. Jasmine is going to paste in the example question or response right now in the chat so you can see what this might look like. And the welcome question is, in the past 2 weeks, I have directly interacted with stakeholders from how many of the following sectors, not including my own sector? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Okay, and I encourage folks just to take a look at the chat. I know we've introduced ourselves already today, but hopefully just looking at what is the level of connection that folks already have. And I was disappointed in preparing my own answer that it wasn't higher when I thought just of the last 2 weeks. Whoever you are or whomever you're representing, welcome. We are grateful that you've joined us, and it is so important to have you all in the room. So there is a tremendous opportunity right now to scale up energy upgrades in affordable housing, as we're seeing an unprecedented influx of new federal funding opportunities from COVID dollars, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act. At the same time, we know that programs created or expanded without consultation, partnership, and co-leadership across sectors and without community will miss opportunities to target community priorities, meet owner and renter needs, and achieve multiple benefits, not just greenhouse gas emission reductions. With that in mind, here are our learning goals for today's session. Learn about people and entities with a potential role to play in scaling up energy retrofits of affordable housing, by which we mean public, subsidized, and unsubsidized housing. Begin to understand some motivations and potential partnership roles of various stakeholders. Draw inspiration from examples of how stakeholders have successfully partnered together and addressed challenges, and identify 1 to 2 next steps in assembling a team to scale up retrofits in your community. So here's a brief outline of what we'll cover today. Please feel free to add your questions to the chat at any time. We will have someone monitoring the chat and collecting questions for the Q&A. Energy upgrade or retrofit programs are often designed without a broad cross-section of stakeholders and community at the table. As a result, they are often designed only with energy goals in mind. It may be difficult to achieve multiple benefits and policy objectives via these programs without including stakeholders from across multiple sectors in that program and policy design process. However, doing so can bring many benefits, for example, achieving multiple policy goals, decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing housing and energy affordability, advancing racial equity, promoting economic inclusion and local workforce development, and improving health and safety. It can also help program planners incorporate valuable perspectives and leadership from groups that are traditionally excluded, such as community members, under-resourced households, renters, and just generally folks from sectors other than energy. It can also leverage input and lessons learned to overcome sector-specific barriers. It can lead to alignment with existing programs and help achieve economies of scale. Stakeholders collaborating on program design might be from different sectors within a state and/or local government, or they may reach across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. For example, energy and housing departments might collaborate within a single city. A sustainability office might work with a state housing finance agency and a housing justice group, or a city department might partner with state energy office or a utility on enhancing weatherization delivery. Community engagement and leadership are essential components of collaborative strategy design. Stakeholder and community engagement can be important avenues for incorporating racial equity into the program development process and outcomes. We know that the burdens of high energy and housing costs and poor housing quality are not shared equally across different incomes and demographic groups. To quote from ACEEE's Energy Equity Initiative, committing to equity in clean energy programs, policies, and investments can improve and expand clean energy services and technologies for marginalized groups while creating more just processes, outcomes, and systems. Many groups have historically been underserved by energy efficiency and clean energy programs, including Black communities, Indigenous communities, people of color, low-income individuals, youth, older adults, recently arrived immigrants, those with limited English proficiency, and people with disabilities. And to this, I would add renters. I want to especially highlight the critical role played by having authentic leadership roles for frontline community-based organizations and leaders. Engaging and funding entities that are closest to frontline communities brings invaluable perspectives and insights into this work. Our community-driven planning training tomorrow will discuss how to build this priority into your processes and teams. So the next portion of this session covers 8 key stakeholder groups who can bring valuable insights in the development of programs to upgrade affordable housing. These groups are energy and sustainability departments within state and local government, community, both community-based organizations and community members, affordable housing owners, providers, and advocates, affordable housing funders and government agencies, whether state or local, low-income energy program administrators, health entities, economic inclusion stakeholders and workforce development providers, and energy or buildings experts and funders. The first group we're going to touch on only briefly because government energy and sustainability offices are not typically overlooked when folks think about clean energy programs. And in fact, they're often leading and setting the vision and goals for government clean energy and climate goals. There are various roles these entities can play. First, they may receive federal funding for clean energy initiatives, both from existing and new funding sources. Other agencies may also receive such funds. Second, they can launch or run or fund retrofit programs using federal or other dollars. We'll cover the Weatherization Assistance Program, which is federally funded and state-run later on in this session. They might focus on specific interventions or technologies that complement existing offerings by other entities. For example, other government agencies or utilities. This might come in the form of rebates, grants, or low, no interest loans. And as an example, the cities of Chicago, Minneapolis, and Cincinnati fund retrofit programs. Third, they can refer to or promote programs via existing touch points, for example, rental licensing, low-income homeownership programs, etc. Fourth, they can require and fund upgrades, sometimes as a condition of receiving funding or participating in certain government programs. Building energy performance standards would fall in this category, though these policies are mandatory. It's important to note that affordable housing will often have trouble complying with these policies unless there is funding available to comply. But energy upgrade requirements can also be attached to voluntary programs or programs that are already funding building rehabilitation. These would generally be run out of a housing agency rather than an energy agency. Fifth, they should be creating accessible processes to bring in community leadership, including by shifting location, times, languages, etc., to accommodate community needs and or supporting community-led work. And these agencies may or may not have strong relationships with community. The second key group we'll cover is community. Here, we're specifically thinking about frontline marginalized and underserved communities. This includes community-based organizations such as environmental justice, social and racial justice, economic justice, tenant rights, and housing justice groups, community leaders of all types, community members, in particular, those who are historically underserved or who face barriers to participating in government processes, such as public hearings, comment opportunities, etc., and homeowners and renters with low incomes, including from both multifamily and single-family properties. Accountability and transparency are especially important for governments and others to consider when collaborating with community members and organizations in order to overcome challenging power dynamics and mistrust that unfortunately may exist. This means setting up structures to ensure that follow-through on commitments occurs, that there is clear communication about roles in the partnership and about how community feedback will be used, and that there is transparent reporting back on a local government's progress, no matter the degree of success. That transparency is really key. So here are some examples of motivations and needs of community stakeholders. These are just examples. Directing benefits to those most impacted by climate change and most left out historically by clean energy programs. Mitigating gentrification, displacement, and high housing and energy costs for households, addressing urgent community priorities that may or may not be aligned with affordable housing retrofit programs, protecting limited time and capacity, having decision-making power alongside government actors and accountability from government actors, developing local economies and contributing to wealth building, and receiving accessible, culturally relevant, clear information about what is being offered and what is possible from a partnership. For example, a list of options in terms of scale, capacity, timeline, etc., rather than asking open-ended questions like, what do you need? So that there's a better sense of how to work together and what role community could play. Community-based organizations' roles in developing energy upgrade programs can go far beyond providing input and gathering input. We'll dig more into this during tomorrow's community-driven planning session. ACEEE's 2021 report, Fostering Equity Through Community-Led Clean Energy Strategies, outlines the following potential roles for community-based organizations in clean energy efforts, which are participating in formal policy processes, developing accountability frameworks and having direct oversight, building community influence through partnerships and coalitions, delivering clean energy services, developing community-led workforce programs and trainings, and building longstanding capacity in communities for locally led clean energy efforts. Role mapping can be a valuable exercise. I'd like to share some insights from our strategic advisor, Climate Innovation. In role mapping, a government or other program administrator takes a look at all the roles needed to run a program and assesses which roles they or consultants are doing well or not well. The goal is to ask, how might ownership be moved closer to the communities being targeted by the programs? Some of the roles or gaps identified might be better carried out by CBOs, and government can share resources to facilitate CBO efforts. In fact, it's important to note that each of these roles should be a funded role, since community partners bring valuable expertise, lived experience, and community connections to the table. Funding may range from stipends, food, and childcare to signed MOUs and contracts for larger amounts. Now I will turn things over to Callie from HR&A Advisors to talk about affordable housing stakeholders.
Thank you, Annika. You hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. I'm Callie Seltzer. I'm a principal at HR&A Advisors, and I am coming to you today from Muncie and Lenape land. I'm in New York City today, based in DC. So a few things we want to talk about on the housing front. And for some of you who are not necessarily involved in housing as part of like your core mission or your work, we're just going to start with some basics, right? Like what housing types need energy upgrades? Well, in the places where we live, most. And you know, the real question is here, how do we work with housing partners to tackle energy upgrades that will lower utility bills, the goals that Annika mentioned, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve resident health, create quality jobs, and advance racial equity. So in short, how do we set and meet our climate and equity goals when so many of the barriers to energy retrofits are actually housing problems? We have a really complex housing ecosystem in the US, and we cannot really solve all of our housing problems with retrofits. I think you all know that kind of intuitively. Retrofits can help with affordability, but unfortunately, we can't retrofit our way out of all of our housing affordability crises. But when we look at this sort of graphic here, the housing we're talking about, we're keeping a very open definition. So we've got all the housing where people who, have a lower or moderate income level live, people who are perhaps more severely burdened by utility bills. We're also including in that your typical affordable housing that has a subsidy. So if there's a public housing or a subsidized housing or rent stabilized housing, and across these, we've got renter occupied, owner occupied, really the whole range of housing that exists in our cities and in our communities today. So what we want to do is to start to lay the groundwork through our collaborations on retrofits that will help us solve the increasingly complex set of housing and energy challenges over time. So it's all about how do we connect together as stakeholders to tackle some of the retrofits that actually set us up for longer and more lasting work together. So I'll move on to the next slide, please. So the government's very involved in housing. We're going to talk for a minute just about the levels of government here. This chart is a very short summary of various housing activities. As you know, federal government is very involved with major programs in housing, such as Section 8 and public housing, home, CDBG, a lot of COVID relief programs and stimulus programs. We really want to key in on your state housing finance agencies. They run a really important production program, if you will, called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's also a critical resource that comes from the state. Actually originally comes from Treasury, but through the states for rehab and renovations, and also potentially for retrofits. So if you're not already familiar with it, start to understand your HFA. They may not have energy goals, but there is a qualified allocation plan, and that's how they allocate money for substantial rehab of affordable housing, and they touch hundreds, thousands of units every year. Depending on the state you're in. And they also, implement a lot of affordable housing policy and other resources as well, and bonds, home block grants, state housing trust funds. There's a lot of motivation here at the state level, to maximize the number of low-income households that can be served through these public dollars. So think about your HFAs at the local level. Of course, localities are increasingly taking on the mantle of production and preservation of affordable housing. In part because there just aren't enough resources at the federal level to address the issues in our communities. So think about how your locality currently subsidizes or provides financing or programs for housing, and the critical connections that really need to be made between the state, the localities, and the federal government, and how do you start to braid these resources together to advance your retrofit programs? Next slide, please. Going to touch briefly on housing funders. This is, again, not an exhaustive list, but think about leverage. That's sort of the key here. What other resources are out there at the private level as well, not just government level, private level. So there's CDFIs who provide financing, technical assistance for affordable housing. They work directly with nonprofit developers. They're a critical part of the financing of a lot of affordable housing. new production and also retrofits and preservation. And they have capital to deploy for low-income communities, and that's part of their mission, right? In a similar way, banks and lending institutions, and you can think of a CDFI in some ways as a nonprofit bank, but your kind of commercial banks and traditional lending institutions increasingly also have capital for meeting environmental sustainability and governance, if you will, ESG goals through ESG bonds. There's a lot of new money out there for banks and lending institutions. They want to be seen as leaders in the climate space. And not to skip over here, the other nonprofit organizations critical to the ecosystem because they are often the developer or the operator of the housing. And they are mission motivated. They exist to serve vulnerable populations and to support and remove barriers for lower income populations in their communities. So be thinking about how all of these funders and different private and public sector actors can contribute to the goals that you're trying to meet for your retrofits. And we'll just, I think, go to
Callie, I think you skipped over the owners slide. Did you want me to circle back to it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let's go to owners. Thanks. So thinking about owners, that is, the person who pays the mortgage every month, not the rent, that would be your renter. Think about the entity that has the financial risk in the property because they built it and they built it or they own it now. It's their business line to own and operate it. You really have to talk to owners to design a program that they'll want to use, right? In so many ways, owners don't have incentives to aligned properly to do retrofits. So they won't necessarily want to partner with you on your retrofit projects, but you need to understand their motivations and make sure that we're designing programs that would entice them to partner. Otherwise, there will be no uptake of the program. You can't get incentives out the door. So you want to partner with them because you can leverage relationships there. You can design programs that are attractive and accommodate compliance constraints, and also think about how you integrate or coordinate with existing funding and financing timelines, as I mentioned earlier. And here on this side, we're just showing kind of the basic breakdown of what is the difference between a housing owner and a property manager. So critical to know who the property managers are and essentially who understands the day-to-day inner workings of the building, like who knows what's leaking and where, which windows are drafty, and really understands where retrofits could be a benefit for residents and for ultimately the financing of the project as well. Thanks, Annika. We'll go to the check-in question. So, and again, we'll just respond to this in the chat. But after hearing about different community and affordable housing stakeholders, thinking about who you're currently coordinating with, what is one new way that you'd like to explore engaging with these partners? So for example, is there a new question that today's conversation has raised for you? A partnership role that you feel like you're positioned to take on that you haven't, explored before, perhaps a new approach, or hey, I think I should actually talk to my city housing department, or someone that you haven't spoken with that you think you need to connect with. Thank you. We're seeing some ideas come in the chat. Yes, healthy materials, community health. Thank you. Great responses, and we're cataloging the chat. You can save the chat by clicking the 3 dots. And with that, I will pass it back to Annika and keep those responses coming. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Callie. Our next stakeholder group is low-income energy program administrators, and I'm going to focus on just 3 types. The first 2 are administrators of the Weatherization Assistance Program and the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. Both are federally funded programs administered by state agencies, though often not the same state agency. Weatherization reduces energy costs for households with low incomes by increasing the energy efficiency of homes or apartments. The Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, addresses energy bill shortfalls and emergencies through bill payment assistance. The third type is utility energy efficiency programs, which are typically administered by utilities, but can also be run by a state agency using utility funds. So why might you want to engage these program administrators? In the case of LIHEAP, there may be the opportunity to receive referrals to past or current program participants or to gain insight into communities experiencing high need. Also, both weatherization and LIHEAP are often implemented by community action agencies, which can have deeper ties to community that can be leveraged. In the case of weatherization and utility programs, there may be an opportunity to achieve economies of scale by piggybacking on existing offerings. And these programs may have gaps that administrators would be eager for partners to fill. Programs may have limitations in what they can or choose to include in their programs. As an example, weatherization must spend its entire federal allocation on an annual timeline, including a recent massive federal cash influx. Despite this cash influx, federal rules mean that agencies can only spend a certain amount per home, meaning that a weatherization administrator or local implementer still has to leverage outside funding if they want to undertake more comprehensive upgrades. Rising construction costs also limit how deep a retrofit can go under existing spending caps. And weatherization turns away many homes, at least initially, because they are not able to allocate enough of their funding for the health and safety needs present in homes, which must be dealt with before weatherization work can occur. Lastly, many community action agencies focus their efforts on 1 to 4 unit properties, or even just on single family homes, even though properties of 5 or more units are also eligible for upgrades. These 3 limitations or gaps, which are comprehensiveness, health and safety, and 5+ multifamily buildings, present potential opportunities for partnership, among others. It's worth talking with your state weatherization administrator or local implementer to see what opportunities they see. For utility programs, utilities may have state-imposed constraints, such as cost-effectiveness tests or self-imposed constraints that result in gaps in their programs. These might include not serving particular building types, for example, only single family or only master metered buildings, only offering quick payback measures such as light bulbs and faucet aerators, so no comprehensive or deep treatment of buildings, or not offering electrification measures such as air source heat pumps or heat pump water heaters. It's worth talking to utility program administrators to understand what gaps exist and to their program implementers, which are typically third parties, to understand opportunities for filling these gaps with new offerings. Community stakeholders and interveners in public utility commission proceedings, for example, clean energy advocates, or even public utility commission staff, can be another good source to learn about utility program gaps and shortcomings. Next up, health entities. The home environment can have a profound influence on health and well-being. Residential retrofits that improve energy efficiency can also make homes safer and healthier, especially when such measures correct indoor air quality issues. Vulnerable populations are especially susceptible to in-home health and safety hazards. Specifically, building upgrades can reduce exposure to mold, moisture, and lead, improve indoor air quality, lower risk of gas leaks or explosions, reduce emergency room visits and missed days of work and school related to asthma and other respiratory diseases, improve mental health, and reduce the thermal stress of extreme heat and cold. There are a variety of health entities working to improve public health and reduce healthcare costs who may be interested in partnering on programs to improve energy efficiency in homes in a way that also improves occupant health. As you can see here, health entities provide a variety of services, and many are also motivated to reduce healthcare costs, which can sometimes be achieved by home upgrades. Some entities are already running healthy home programs that seek to remove asthma triggers and lead hazards from homes. These may be municipal, nonprofit, or private. So health initiatives and healthy homes programs may also present opportunities to piggyback on existing efforts, and we've borrowed and adapted this chart. Homes with health hazards are often inefficient as well. And there are some key measures that can improve both health and energy efficiency simultaneously. For example, replacing failing gas equipment. There's others. Another type of intervention might be repairing a hole in the roof where moisture is intruding and then installing insulation in the newly dry attic or walls. On this slide are some examples of health programs that present potential partnership opportunities. And in these examples, funding comes from the federal level and is then administered locally. We see examples where entities are running in-home lead abatement programs, working to modify homes to remove asthma triggers, working to reduce federal healthcare spending via clean energy upgrades, et cetera. It may be worth talking to health entities in your area to understand the types of in-home health and safety hazards they're most concerned about, to access their health data, and to discuss the potential for partnership. The next category is economic inclusion and workforce stakeholders. We'll use our partner Emerald Cities Collaborative's definition of economic inclusion. Economic inclusion goes beyond workforce development. It includes high road employment and contracting opportunities and improved access to those opportunities for historically marginalized people and communities, i.e. BIPOC, women, at-risk youth, et cetera. The high road employment part of this is what is traditionally referred to as workforce development and refers specifically to individuals. There's also a business support ecosystem that works with contractors and businesses. And high road here refers to policies that encourage competition based on quality rather than cost, and favors firms that internalize the true costs of business by providing good wages, benefits, growth opportunities, and working conditions, adhering to laws and regulations, and pursuing best practices with respect to community engagement and the environment. Who are the key stakeholders in this category? In this case, we're looking across both workforce and business development. So we have community colleges and universities that can offer training, supply contractors or students for the workforce. Universities may operate weatherization training centers. There are city or county workforce development agencies that may run programs for incumbent workers to upskill or provide services like case management or job placement to opportunity youth who are low-income 16 to 24-year-olds who have left high school or are underemployed. There are also Youth Build or Job Corps program administrators. These are programs for opportunity youth funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. Youth Build primarily builds homes for low-income households. There are 273 Youth Build programs across the country. Youth Build administrators may be CBOs or any of the entities I just named. Job Corps administrators may be nonprofit or for-profit entities running one of over 121 Job Corps centers across the country. In terms of the business support ecosystem, you have apprenticeship program administrators such as unions, labor management organizations, et cetera, small business development centers that are locally administered centers funded by the Small Business Administration, providing technical assistance, coaching, and access to loans, and business associations and chambers of commerce, including minority business enterprise, women business enterprise, and specific ethnic business associations, and specialized chambers of commerce, for example, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Why should you reach out to workforce and business development stakeholders? Again, some wisdom from our partner Emerald Cities Collaborative. Climate actions such as building retrofits result in demand for certain types of goods and services. These are economic opportunities, but details really matter. So how retrofits are implemented will influence whether economic outcomes are high road and equitable. These efforts will either reinforce existing economic disparities or change them. And without intentionally working to correct for inequities, retrofit projects will tend to be part of a larger system that will inadvertently perpetuate inequities by reinforcing exclusion, low road jobs, and wealth disparities. Focusing on economic inclusion can help align retrofit work with other priorities within a jurisdiction, including economic recovery, racial equity, and repairing harm from government actions. Partnership might look a lot of different ways. Retrofit projects can create community benefits, such as opportunities for local workers and for businesses located within or connected to disadvantaged communities. Partnerships can establish community benefits agreements with the community, set targets and require reporting on hiring workers from disadvantaged communities, create opportunities for workers or those who have been left out of the labor force to receive training, and leverage retrofit projects for on-the-job training or other work-based learning. So on to energy and building experts and funders. These are the types of folks you may already be used to working with for clean energy projects. So this includes technical experts who can advise on building needs, program design, appropriate technologies, costs, and benefits. This can include how to ensure that electrification results in stable or lower bills for low-income residents rather than higher bills, for example. Energy service companies operate performance-based programs and can manage and finance large upgrade projects. Clean energy advocacy organizations are often familiar with gaps and shortcomings of existing programs, new and emerging models, and best practices in the field. Green banks, where they exist, not everywhere, can combine public and private funds to speed adoption of commercially available technologies. And implementers of on-bill programs can offer energy upgrades to a utility customer at no or reduced upfront cost, with repayment tied to the customer's utility bill or meter. Now I will turn things over to Dee Morales to share some case studies of collaboration across some of these sectors and with community.
Great, thanks, Annika. So in these next few slides, I'll be talking about some case studies of collaboration across different stakeholders we've already discussed. So the first one on the list is DC's Affordable Housing Retrofit Accelerator Program, which is an example of city government working with affordable housing stakeholders. The city engaged a roundtable of affordable housing owners and nonprofits to develop recommendations on how to design building energy performance standard rules that make compliance feasible for affordable housing. The Minneapolis 4D program is an example of working across local government departments. The city collaborated across economic development and sustainability departments on the 4D program, which proved to be a successful strategy for collaborating to both preserve affordable housing and provide energy incentives. Providence, Rhode Island provides an example of frontline communities and leadership roles for developing the city's climate action plan through the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee, which integrates the concerns and needs of marginalized communities into the city's sustainability work and decision-making processes. Milwaukee's home-funded rental rehabilitation loan program is an example of an ongoing process involving collaboration between community leaders and city government staff. The program was largely developed by city government staff and informed by some consultation with community-based organizations, small property developers, and lenders. Next slide, please. So this next case study is based on a blog post by Slipstream, which is an energy efficiency nonprofit, where they shared honest reflections on collaborating with a local CBO and a utility on a pilot project aimed at low-income households. And we'd like to take a moment to commend Slipstream on this type of honest reflection, where they show that collaboration and partnerships are not always easy. And so some of the lessons learned from this case study are that breaking commitment to community breaks community trust and undermines CBOs. So in this instance, when the utility changed program offerings without any sort of explanation, this broke trust with their partners, the CBOs, and the communities that it was trying to target. The next is that making assumptions about community needs and carrying forward with assumptions without asking any questions is a clear sign of problematic power dynamics. It's important to know that communities often know their own solutions. And the last lesson that we highlight here is to trust community-based partners to course correct with you and maybe even prove you wrong. In the case study, both Slipstream and the utility had to learn to get comfortable taking a back seat, which is not always easy. And there's, of course, a lot more to say here, but we'll be touching more on collaboration with CBOs in the panel after the break, so please stay tuned for that. And I believe the next slide is over to Annika.
Great, thanks, Steve. We've thrown a lot of information at you. What can partnerships among these entities look like? Say you want to create a program that works for subsidized affordable housing, then partners like the State Housing Finance Agency, local affordable housing developers, and CDFIs might be key. On the other hand, if you want a program that fills health and safety gaps in the weatherization assistance program, then the state energy office, local community action agencies, the city health department, environmental justice organizers, and even a local health provider might be the right fit. For a program that seeks to fill workforce gaps and serve unsubsidized housing, you might work with your city's housing department, a local affordable housing advocacy group, a tenant rights organization, and your local community college, for example. These are just hypothetical scenarios, and there are many permutations of local stakeholders who could help your department or organization accurately assess the highest priority issues and the most promising solutions to address them. So for our check-in question, given the priorities, needs, and/or gaps in your community, which stakeholder who is not at the table is it most important to bring to the table? If you don't know the highest priorities, greatest needs, or biggest program gaps in your community, consider that community might be your answer that you would put in the chat. So please go ahead and put your answers in the chat. Okay, I look forward to seeing what comes in and reflecting on what people have shared. Please take a look at what your peers are sharing here. So Dee is now going to bring us home with our last topic, potential next steps to engage with community and across sectors.
Great, thank you. So one of the potential next steps we'd like to highlight is called ecosystems mapping. And this slide is from the perspective of a government agency needs, such as an energy or sustainability agency. So one of the first steps in ecosystem mapping is to secure participation from other government agencies and identify trusted CBOs that are working on issues like climate change, climate resilience planning, environmental justice, anti-displacement, and energy affordability, to name a few on the list. The partners that you'd like to partner with should be aligned, accountable, connected, and have the capacity to collaborate long-term. So to start doing this work, you might want to start doing some research on potential partners online or through your own networks. Once you've identified some potential partners, you can meet with 1 to 3 potential CBOs. Select your partners and provide compensation to CBOs for the expertise that they bring. And a very important step in this process is to find time to develop a plan for power sharing and decision-making processes with your CBO partners. And the resource that is listed in the slide is an ecosystem mapping process guide, which includes criteria on how you would select a CBO partner. So if you have more detailed questions or want to find more detail, please find, you can find it in this resource here. Next slide, please. So one of the next steps that you can start taking is to start engaging stakeholders in conversations. And this work takes time, so it's best to start immediately. And so to start stakeholder conversations, much like we've already mentioned, identify trusted entities that are already doing some of the work that you're interested in partnering around. Reach out to the stakeholder types listed in this presentation and try to understand and find alignment with your stakeholders' needs, motivations, and current programming, as well as identifying challenges that you and your partners that you might encounter along the way. Next slide, please. And last but not least, we'd also like to highlight the importance of starting to do community engagement as an important next step. And note that not all the different types and ways to do community engagement are equally impactful. So the spectrum that you see here is called the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. And it's both a self-assessment tool and a planning tool created by Facilitating Power. So you might need it as one or both. And more impactful community engagement starts to happen toward the right of the spectrum at 3, 4, and 5. And so voice elevates the needs and assets of communities into processes and planning. Delegated power increases the capacity of communities to play leadership roles and in making decisions. And community ownership fosters democratic participation and bridges the divide between community and governance. So on the spectrum, you might be at a 3 and want to improve, but not be able to move up to 4 or 5 until you have more things in place, like resources, removal of constraint, increased staff support, or trying to find ways to increase the capacity of the community to participate in some of these activities. So the concept of community planning, community-driven planning will be covered in a separate webinar tomorrow. There's obviously a lot to cover here, so please join us tomorrow afternoon for some more detail on this. And over to you, Annika. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. As we wrap up, I wanted to reshare the learning goals and takeaways for today's session. We'll be asking for your feedback in a post-summit survey. Please let us know how we can improve this presentation and other sessions to better help you reach these learning goals. Lastly, here are links to resources we shared, mentioned, or drew on during this presentation. You'll be able to access these links once we post the presentations online in the next week or so. Thank you for being here today. And thanks to our partners and our strategic advisor, Climate Innovation. And of course, also thanks to our funders. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika, Dee, and Callie. We will now get into some questions from the audience. And just as a reminder, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please submit it in the chat, and we'll have someone going through all the questions to ensure that we get through as many as possible. So I'll get started and jump into some questions that were asked at the beginning. Manufactured homes and mobile homes tend to house LMI populations and have horrid energy efficiency issues, yet many of the considerations for upgrades don't fit these homes. Do the new incentives affect these types of homes?
Stephanie, you may be disappointed in my answer, which is that I think you're the person best situated to answer this question. I will say it varies among utilities, for example, whether their programs apply to manufactured homes. Certainly these homes are in need of upgrades. Do you have thoughts, Stephanie, on the new federal funding?
So I know that a lot of the new federal funding has been pretty open, and when it comes to ARPA funds, there are different uses, and the federal government has made sure to keep the rules rather open. And so this is the ARPA state and local funding, and a lot of the IRA funding is still being developed, so I can't necessarily answer as to whether manufactured homes are being included in that as well. Anyone else want to chime in before we go on to the next question?
I would just add that it's worth thinking about sort of the underlying structure of manufactured housing ownership and how do we create opportunities for people to own the land out from under their homes. And there's a lot of great organizations like Rock USA that do that. And in tandem, they get to control for their physical units and upgrade their units accordingly, not always relying on a corporate owner. So.
Thanks. Would you explain what the initials for CDFI stand for?
I can do that. Sure. So it's Community Development Financial Institution. And if you look up the CDFI fund on the Department of Treasury, you'll find information about what CDFIs are, what they do, who they fund. But essentially, they operate like a bank to fund communities and projects that traditional banks consider too risky.
Thanks, Callie. How does one motivate affordable housing funding agencies to prioritize, evaluate, or verify energy efficiency goals?
I think this is really tough. It really varies across agencies, whether they're already motivated to prioritize energy efficiency goals. And there's a great resource by Dana Bartlemay from when she was at the National Housing Trust that goes through state by state, how housing finance agencies in particular are prioritizing energy efficiency within their funding decisions. I would say it's a matter of shifting the emphasis from upfront costs to ongoing operating costs. I think there's an overemphasis right now on upfront costs, and new types of accounting are needed to encourage these agencies to focus on the ways that energy efficiency has positive financial benefits in the long term. Callie, did you have anything you want to add?
That's good.
That's good.
Okay, we have another question. How do you suggest starting community engagement with LMI folks when there are competing priorities for folks such as trouble paying bills, rent, and other issues? How do you suggest taking folks from survival mode to engagement?
I think that's a really great question that may be answered in the CBO panel that's coming up next, since these folks have had a lot of experience with these sorts of grappling with these sorts of questions.
I mean, I think one key thing is that we can't expect free work from folks who are already extremely constrained, dealing with competing priorities and trying to put out fires in their community. Right, so we need to be resourcing feedback and other types of work, arranging all the way up to signing MOUs and contracts when we're engaging with low and moderate income folks. Their expertise is real and it should be valued.
So I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up. And that will be, how can manufacturers of clean energy products get more involved with community programs and government initiatives to directly address the needs being discussed here?
It's a question I haven't thought a lot about. I think get in touch with your local community. I think so much of this starts from conversations and from understanding what the needs are, and really just opening up the avenues of communication to understand what the opportunities are. Callie, do you have other thoughts to add?
I would just add that, you know, similar to what we've said earlier about how most utility programs for retrofits are best suited to market rate. A lot of products that are out there also are best suited to market rate. And we really need to push the non-market rate agenda with these manufacturers, and they help them see the market that exists for their products and the partners that are coming together to use these technologies.
So I think we can do one more question, and I see that Steve Gelb has his hand up. So if we can unmute him, and then that'll be our final question or comment.
Yeah, I didn't have a question. I wanted to help answer the last question about manufacturers. I'm Steve Gelb with Emerald Cities Collaborative. They can play a key role in training and development. So they do a lot of workforce training, and you can get manufacturers involved with aligning with training programs that train HVAC technicians and weatherization and so on, also supporting especially minority contractors to be engaged in the industry. So I just wanted to add that.